You have to let me start. I have to give my cold opening before I pet you. The only Warhammer I'm currently interested in is the one that's going to end my suffering. Hey everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, helping you decide, is that book worth reading of a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? I can't slap it as hard as I can because I'm half afraid I'm going to slap her now. Will you let me finish my intro before you get in my face? Please? Today's book is Warhammer, Death's Messenger. This is the first book in a trilogy known as Blood on the Riek, as far as I could find, and was written by Sandy Mitchell and published on March 29, 2005. According to the back, as I mentioned in my TBR, this is book 113 in the entire Black Library, which is the compendium of the entire Warhammer Fantasy. I don't know if it includes 40k in there, but if it does, that would explain why it's so huge. But if it is just fantasy, that would make this part of one of the largest expanded universes that I've ever delved into, with the main exception of the actual Star Wars EU. So that definitely means that I'm going to have to be a bit more liberal about what books I read and don't. Now, doing some small part to that, and to the fact that I'm not the biggest fan of Warhammer Fantasy. I at least know a good portion of the 40k lore, but again, that was just to make fun of my friend who does like it. I decided to bring in an expert, like I did last video. Now, this expert is my good friend Ynotplaygames, a real-time strategy game YouTuber who is pretty well known with the Warhammer area. Mostly 40k, but as far as I'm aware, he has a fairly decent knowledge of the fantasy world as well. So, without further ado, why not?
Hello, I'm Ynotplaygames, the war game fanatic. You can check me out at Ynotplaygames on YouTube. Warhammer Fantasy is an old setting made by Games Workshop to introduce a grim, dark setting in fantasy stories, taking liberal inspirations in creating its unique world. It has unique factions like the Human Empire, mountain-loving dwarves, elves, and their edgier cousins, dark elves, and orcs. Then there's some funner factions like Egyptian mummies, vampires, lizard folks, chaotic demons, and beastmen, all with the one goal to be on top, to save the world or consume it. I am a huge fan of Games Workshop stuff. I actually play mostly 40k stuff and a bit of the tabletop games. I used to play fantasy until they took away my Tomb Kings for the new Age of Sigmar. The fantasy setting is good, and I've heard a few good stories and books from here, with most games having its setting in the Warhammer Fantasy. The grim darkness in this realm, I wonder how this book fares in the Black Library.
Thanks, why not? Now, let's go on to the ratings. And after that, we move on to where we always start. The cover. Now, when it comes to this cover, I'm a little mixed on it. Solely without anything, this is very much a cover that I enjoy. It's fantasy art, but I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a Chaos Worshipper army or just like the regular Imperial army. These are definitely humans, at least as far as I'm aware, but the one in the lead is like heavily scarred and looks like he'll smash your head in with that warhammer if you even get near him, which I might take him up on this. But then you have the main focus, the rider, who's wearing tattered robes, has scripture hanging from behind him like a banner, while also wearing scripture on his chest like armor. His horse is covered in skulls, like an unnecessary amount of skulls. Like the one on top of the horse's head looks completely unnecessary. I don't even know how it stays up there, to be honest. Well, it also has something on its reins that clearly says repent. So on one hand, while I do think if this is supposed to be a Chaos Worshipper army, that repent makes me think, okay, maybe it's not that, because I mean, what I do know of the Chaos Gods in the Warhammer lore, they don't really care about repenting. So maybe this is an Imperial army. Overall, it doesn't even really tie into the book itself, to be honest. I don't really recall a scene from this book where an army gathers at all. So with that, I have to say I'm very neutral about this. But that's from a non-fan. Let's hear from a fan. Why not? What do you think of the cover? And by the way, feel free to toss in the synopsis while you're at it.
Thoughts on the cover. The cover is fun. Gives me the vibe of Warhammer, moody and broody. I have to say, the horse and the rider do look a bit chaos worshipy. But when you know enough about the lore, it gets easy to blur things together. Sometimes you can't tell one fanatic from another. And with the crowd around him, I'm unsure if that's supposed to be more cultist, disheveled citizens abandoning their fallen home, or just a peasant army stack, as we all need one day. The synopsis sounds like the classic adventuring story with some Warhammer spice. And though beastmen being linked to chaos is always an iffy thing, I mean, I know beastmen work with chaos sometimes, but chaos doesn't always work with beastmen, and sometimes beastmen are just beastmen doing beastmen things. Also, heading to Marienburg, I mean, sure it's a major port, but there's plenty of safer towns further south. And if I remember from the end times story, never mind, nothing ends well in the end times.
Thanks for that. The less I have to talk about this book, the better. Which kind of gives you the basic idea of how I felt about this book as we go into the review section. Now, even though I started with that, let me go out of my way and say that as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to a novel that expands the universe it's from, I think this book is written really well. I don't feel like I needed to be deeply entrenched in Warhammer lore to be able to understand half of what's being written here. It very much stands on its own, and I feel like anyone could really pick this book up and enjoy the setting and understand it enough to get what's going on. There are a few instances where I was scratching my head in frustration because from the general knowledge of these kinds of things, I'm like, okay, that doesn't line up with how it's being treated. Like, one specific example was that what is the difference between the magic users in this world? Okay, so you have witches, which just being accused of it is good enough to get burned at the stake for some people. Or there's sorcerers, which again, just being suspected of it, get your house set on fire. But then you have wizards, who are also magic users, that are not only common in adventuring parties, but are also in the Imperial Army and considered, like heavy guns. So clearly they're accepted to some degree. So I'm kind of left with, what's the difference? Is it like a D&D kind of separation? Witches of this world's warlocks, where they make deals with big powers? Or are we talking like sorcerers are naturally born magic users? At which point I ask, why are they hated so much that, just being suspected of being a sorcerer lights your house on fire? And why would they need to study? Because it's implied that they found out this one character is a sorcerer because she had certain tomes in her house. And then, if that's the case, what separates a wizard from being a sorcerer if you need to study? It opened a lot of questions about the magic that I kind of had to push off, otherwise I was going to drive myself insane. But other than that, I would say that for the most part, this stands on its own, and it is a more minor point in the large scheme of things. I will give the book that credit. But no, my issues with this book stem beyond how it works as a fandom increasing book. The main fact is I had a lot of trouble liking the main character, Rudy Walder. I'm not going to go on record and say he was as bad as some of the other main characters I've dealt with. You put Rudy next to Eli Yananakis from The Compound, or at least the early pages, Rudy is downright goody two-shoes, and I would take him every day. And so I can say he wasn't nearly as bad as enough to make me want to put down the book and just stop reading. But on that also same front, he only came off as sympathetic or like a person I wanted to follow when I compared him to other people in this world who were much worse. Yeah, Rudy is bad, but when I compare him to Gerhard, the witch hunter who basically accuses him of chaos worship and is very quick to people for even being near chaos worship, then yeah, okay, Rudy's a better character. When I compare Rudy to his two bullies, the Katzenjammer twins, or not twins, brothers. When I compare Rudy to the Katzenjammer brothers, who are basically big bullies, yeah, he's a better character. But on his own, Rudy is not a good character at all. For example, let's start with the fact that Rudy's sexist. Like, I'm not even going to sugarcoat that. The dude is a sexist bent. Like, okay, when it first started, the first indication was literally in the first few pages, where while he's out in the woods hunting, he runs across Hannah, our secondary lead. Hopefully, I did a good job of explaining that. He runs across Hannah, our female protagonist, who he feels the need to complain about, not for any reason other than he doesn't like the fact that she's confident this deep into the woods when she doesn't have his manly hunter training. Like, that is the main reason he's upset with her in this scene. And you know what? I brushed this off. Okay, on one hand, it could be that it's setting up flaws with him. He's sexist, but it's something he's got to work on as the story goes on. You know, flawed protagonists are much more interesting than perfect ones. Or maybe there's something I don't know. Maybe this force is much more dangerous than Hannah is willing to accept, and that's what annoys him. After all, it's only a few pages later that he comes across the Beastmen tracks. So when I first clocked this, I was able to push it to the side with the thoughts that, okay, there might be stuff here I don't know. But no, as the story goes on, the more I'm forced to conclude that Rudy is like the fact that at one point this dude is about to have his ass beat like a bongo by the two Katzenjammer brothers. And Hannah comes by and saves him. She convinces the Katzenjammer she's going to put a curse on them if they don't leave him alone, because Hannah, as much as she's not very fond of Rudy, wasn't about to watch him get beat in the street. You want to know how grateful Rudy is? He gets up and then complains about how arrogant she is for thinking she saved him. Again, could be a flaw he's got to work on. Maybe he's just prideful that someone else saved him. No. Again, it continues. Like the fact that because of this scene that she later gets accused of witchcraft because one of the Katzenjammer twins falls ill with the plague. And this little curse thing that she did made him accuse her of being a witch while the witch hunter is in town. Now, we've already seen the extreme measures that Gerhard will go to an extent, so this is clearly bad. And the whole town turns against her almost immediately, chanting, "Burn the witch, burn the witch." So Rudy, doing the good thing, I gave him points here, he does do the right thing, immediately helps sneak her out of town so mob mentality can't take over and Hannah gets killed for something she clearly is not. This little bastard thinks to himself, as he's escorting this girl out, who just heard all of her family friends shouting they want to kill her, can only think, man, I kind of like Hannah now that she's being quiet. She's much more likable. Oh, that's not even the worst part. The worst part is after a couple days, when the town's finally calming down and him and Hannah are acknowledging that, you know, maybe she can go back into town now that mob mentality has died down and people are willing to listen to reason. The witch hunter Gerhard even says that there's no evidence she's a witch, and the fact that the two people who accused her are not very reputable, and he kind of narrowed down what was wrong with one of the brothers. You know, he doesn't believe that she's a witch. So Rudy rues the fact that she's going to leave. Now, why does he rue? You maybe think, oh, maybe they finally connected, maybe they're getting to know each other, because obviously the book hints that these two are going to become an item. But maybe, you know, they're connecting to each other, maybe they're realizing they have more in common than either of them wanted to admit, maybe they're becoming friends. No. This little jerk-off decides that he's sad to see her go because she keeps his house clean and she cooks really well. Yeah, at a certain point, it just stops being. I can't excuse it anymore. Rudy is a sexist bastard, and thankfully it does fade. It doesn't become as prevalent in the second half of the book, but it did happen enough that it stained my perception of it. But you know what? As big as that flaw is, it is still a single flaw. Maybe that was something Rudy can, you know, work on. Maybe that was something that just humanizes Rudy. You know, he's our character, but he is kind of a misogynist. So, yeah, okay, whatever. Unfortunately, that is not the only issue I had with Rudy. Again, I'm not going on record and saying he's, like, horrible like someone like Eli Yananakis. But he does enough things that I just don't like him. Like when he lies to the Burgomeister, or the mayor, about the fact that he more misleads than lies, to be fair, but he misleads the Burgomeister about thinking the Beastmen are still around the town, because every day ever since the Beastmen tracks were found, they've been bringing all the people into the town and closing it off to protect them. And during that time, Rudy has become very relied upon by the influential people of the town as a messenger, as someone who keeps an eye out on the forest and all that. So Rudy is living the high life. So when it becomes clear that his high life might be threatened, Rudy misleads the Burgomeister about thinking the Beastman threat is still very tangible, despite the fact he has no evidence, because he doesn't want to give up that high life. Or the fact that he is dumb. He is so dumb. Dumb. So there's one point where the story tries to present what the decision he's making is based on a traumatic denial about what just happened. But to me, there's only a certain level of denial in a story character, a certain level of denial a character can go through before they just come off as stupid and purposefully lying to themselves. What does he do?
Oh man. My father was just killed, and several people I knew personally, including my good friend Magnus, just tried to have me killed as a part of a chaos ritual as they loudly chanted, "Hail the vessel." And now the witch hunter assumes that I'm a chaos worshipper. I have to run. But where do I go? I know. I'll go seek out my good friend Magnus, who has done nothing to harm me in the past, and will surely not only help me out, but explain things to me.
Whoa. Hold on. Didn't Magnus literally just try to cut you open like a sack of potatoes for a sacrifice, all while claiming "Hail the vessel"?
No, he clearly just meant he wanted me to hail a fishing boat for a ride.
Personally, I would have found that Hannah was a much more likable main protagonist than Rudy would have been. She's a well fleshed out character. She has decent goals. She has, well, I say decent goals, but she has a decent mystery to her, and she just feels more relevant, more in line with what a main character is, as opposed to Rudy. And don't get me wrong, I know something got revealed about Rudy that was not subtly hinted at. Like, from the first instant that it starts hinting at it, you pretty much guess what's going to happen. But it's not just my dislike of Rudy that made me not like this book. There was also the fact that the book is just not written very well. Okay, that's not a good way of putting it. It's just it's the way the book is written as well. Like the fact that the story is overly verbose, using 20 words to say what it could say in 5. Or the fact that the book is very sesquipedalian. I think I said that right. Excuse me if I didn't. But for those of you clicking on dictionary.com to figure out what that means, let me dumb it down for you. It means this book likes to use big words to sound smart, which in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. These big words can help you achieve a more archaic tone, since this is supposed to be taking place in, a basically medieval fantasy version of Germany. At least the empire that it talks about. It's very German based. But our main character, Rudy, and this kind of goes back into my point where I think Hannah would have made a better main character. But our main character, Rudy, is an uneducated farm boy who, on numerous occasions, makes sure to remind the audience he can't read. So, in a sense, it's kind of immersion breaking when you have lines like, "The cadaverous merchant squeezed his face in consternation as he examined the porous outcropping of fetid malady." And then 2 pages later, I have Rudy being like, "Well, I don't know what hypothetical means, but that sounds bad." And it's like, that is so immersion breaking. You either commit to the fact that Rudy doesn't know what big words mean and use more simple words, because you are telling the story from his point of view, or you don't. My point is, ultimately, though, when the character we're following is an uneducated farm boy who can't read, using huge 5-syllable words throughout the entirety of the book just does not make sense to me. Personally, I think it would have worked better if the book had more heavily committed to third-person omniscient, because then at least you would have been very much outside of Rudy's POV. We'd just be seeing things as an eagle-eye god. But no, the book is very much third-person limited, but occasionally dips its toe into the omniscient pile. Like, we never break away from Rudy. That right there, we never break away from them. Very Steven Universe in that kind of way. Occasionally, the book will just suddenly tell us exactly what a character is feeling, as if the author doesn't trust you as an audience member to understand that. So there is that issue as well. But there's also small little things like plot holes, like between chapters 6 and 7. Now, chapter 6 starts with them starting a discussion. This is the talk I said where Rudy misleads the Burgomeister about the Beastman threat so he can stay in his high life power. The thing that sparked this argument was the fact that this plague that's spreading through the town had just killed an old woman. And now they have to look at the plague not just as a sickness sweeping through town like the flu, but they have to look at it as a dangerous disease. And because everyone is coming into town and scrunching together at night, that disease is spreading much faster than it should. At that point, there's at least, you can see the two sides of the argument. The Burgomeister wants to keep bringing people in at night because it's safer, and as far as he knows, only one person has died, an old woman. So it's possible that this disease, while potentially deadly, most people will survive, except for the elderly, or like immunocompromised kind of people. Hannah's mother, Greta. Hannah's mother wants to start opening the town at night because she wants to try to stem the spread of this infection as fast as possible. She doesn't want the entire town getting sick, and she fears that this will be much more deadly than just one old woman dying. So you can see at least both sides of the argument. But then in chapter 7, it immediately creates a plot hole by saying, no, it wasn't just Greta, but 3 people have died to this disease. Which completely throws out a lot of the arguments being made, because they were all being made from the position that only one old woman had died from this disease. And while that's a minor plot hole, it is still a plot hole all the same. Another issue I have is, okay, so I read the back of the book on my TBR. So you have a fair idea of what it says. If you don't, feel free to go check it out real quick. But simply put, the back of the book would have you believe that a bulk of the story is about Rudy after Rudy got accused of chaos worship and is on the run, fleeing the Imperial people looking for him and the witch hunter. However, the book actually spends about half its runtime in the town building up to that moment. So the book is less about that and more about, it's kind of a mixture of the beginning of the plot and the first 2.5 sentences of this and the rest of it. And even then, it's not completely accurate. Like, it says here that when a group of savage beastmen attack the village, they don't ever attack the village. What ends up happening, as mentioned by Ynot, is that the beastmen attack what I assume is Nurgle worshippers while they're about to commit their ceremony. And this is what leads to Rudy being accused of chaos worship, because they find his adopted father there, as well as several people he was close with. So the savage beastmen never attack his village. And admittedly, that's fine. Honestly, I didn't mind that so much. But the way the back is worded, if you read the back before you dived into this book, the story would be very annoying for you to read. Because when the story spoils itself like that, you just sit there and you wait for the inevitable. This is going to happen, so you're just kind of reading and being like, why aren't we there yet? Almost. It was never a question of whether or not Rudy would be able to stop the tide of the events. We know something's going to happen, that the beastmen are going to kill a bunch of villagers. We know that Rudy's going to get accused of chaos worship and have to go on the run. So again, most of that first passage, well, I admit would be entertaining if it hadn't been spoiled. I was more or less just reading like, is he going to get accused of this or not? Another small issue I guess I'm gonna bring up here real quick, and be advised, this is very much a subjective point of view on mine. It's more of an explanation why I don't really like grimdark stories very much. But that's because most grimdark stories are kind of predictable to me. I can pretty much predict whatever's going to happen in a grimdark story by just applying Murphy's Law to the whole thing. Most grimdark stories literally follow what can go wrong for our characters will. I don't hate dark fantasy in general. Again, I go for grimdark in this specific instance, but I will definitely say that this definitely edged more into dark fantasy than grimdark, but there were still moments of characters There's still moments of people making decisions solely to screw over our characters rather than any kind of logic behind it. One such example is when Rudy and our Hannah are on the run. While they're in a roadside tavern, they meet a group of adventurers who, playing a bit to their egos, get the two really drunk, and Rudy and Hannah wake up the next day, with hangovers. The bar is like trashed a little bit, and they have this huge tab because the adventurers just took off without paying for anything. In this case, it's very clear that Rudy isn't so much stiffing the bartender who's trying to make him pay for everything because he doesn't want to pay, but simply because he literally has no money to pay for anything. He even pours all of his money out and says, I can't give you any more than this. But the bartender immediately goes to Rudy is trying to rip him off. Legitimately, Rudy is trying to say, nope, I'm just paying for this, bye. The servant girl goes out to get all his sons. They all gang up on him and beat him up, then throw him down in the basement where they'll lock him up until road wardens, which I'm guessing are police, come by to pick him up, which is bad for Rudy, who's been accused of chaos worship. The reason this comes off as unbelievable to me is there's no attempt at all of compromise. It's not the bartender's upset, but you know what, okay, I'm not going to get my money just by turning him into the police. So he can work him and his girl can work in my bar for a few days to work off their tab. Bartender gets free labor and gets his money's worth. Or, you know what, I think a better rendition of the scene wouldn't have been the bartender trying to force them to pay the money, but one of his sons finding the wanted posters for Hannah and Rudy and basically throwing them both in the basement to turn them in. That would have worked much better. But no, this is all over an adventuring party who left them with the bill, and Rudy, not for lack of want, being unable to pay because he doesn't have the money, and trying to compromise with this innkeeper who's not being compromising in the slightest. That's kind of what I mean when I say I don't like, grimdark fantasies. It's because characters act like this because it's trying to paint a cynical worldview. It's trying to paint a cynical view of the entire world. It's also one of those things. If there's a character who's being nice, altruistic or a philanthropist, chances are they're just gonna be a secretly evil person the entire time. Happens more than once in this book. But yeah, in the end, 5 out of 10. But that's a view from a non-fan. Let's see what the fan has to think. Why not? What do you think of the book?
My thoughts on the book? The plot twists were crazy. Magnus the Red becoming a witch hunter, and what they did to Caldor Drago. Oh, and I couldn't believe that some guy named Gilman showed up with this ultra force of Imperial Paladins. What a bunch of Mary Sues. Oh, and don't get me started on The Lion and the Rock.
You didn't read it, did you? Well, okay. Personally, I'm not sure how I'd recommend this book to. I guess if you have an inkling for dark fantasy works and need a fix, it's fine. Again, I'm not a biggest fan of dark fantasy, but I kind of went into my reasons why. Or, maybe you're just someone who wants to collect all 100 plus of the Warhammer Fantasy books, in which case, yeah, go ahead and grab it. It's nothing like some of the worst books I've reviewed on this channel. It's competently written in most places. Despite the verboseness and this sesquipedalian nature of it, it really isn't badly written. It's not like, there's no typos. It's not like a jittery pace. It doesn't really, despite the fact that it lies to you, I think if it hadn't lied to me on the back, the entire front half wasn't exactly going to be as tedious as it felt. So when it comes to the question, does it deserve Mount Doom? The answer is no. And trust me, that was a hard decision for me to make. Trust me, that was a tough decision for me to make. Personally, I probably will never read this again. And reading this book didn't really leave me with a big desire to seek out the sequel or the rest of the Warhammer Fantasy. But I won't say it completely turned me off either. If I find the sequel, I might pick it up out of curiosity to see if maybe it gets better. Other than that, like I said, it's just one of those books I might just get rid of if I need to make space on my shelf, but it's not bad. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got to say about it. Any final words for us? Why not?
Greatest of stories, but Warhammer has plenty of great books. And you should check out books about Nagash, Archeon, Gotrek, and Felix. Some of my favorite stories. And if books aren't more of your thing, you can come check out my channel, where I'll be playing war games, including Total War Warhammer 3. And let's see if I can get the humans to live past turn 10.
Excellent. Thank you. But now we look ahead. The next book is... Oh, I see it coming. I'm hoping it's not going to give me as much resistance as this one. I swear I've heard this author's name before. But until then, remember, with every book comes an adventure. And every adventure's worth having. Even the bad ones.